no son. That's not a good thing. All right, so let's read from Hosea. The word of the Lord, which came to Hosea, the son of Beri, during the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and during the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel. When the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, "Go, take yourself a wife of harlotry, and have children of harlotry. For the land commits flagrant harlotry, forsaking the Lord." So he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. And the Lord said to him, "Name him Jezreel, for yet a little while, and I will punish the house of Jehu for the bloodshed of Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. On that day, I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel." Then she conceived again and gave birth to a daughter. And the Lord said to her, "Name her Lo-Ruhamah, for I will no longer have compassion on the house of Israel, that I would ever forgive them. But I will have compassion on the house of Israel and deliver them by the Lord their God, and will not deliver them by bow, sword, battle, horses, or horsemen." And when she had weaned Lo-Ruhamah, she conceived and gave birth to a son. And the Lord said, "Name him Lo-Ammi, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. Yet the number of the sons of Israel will be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered. And in the place where it is said to them, 'You are not my people,' it will be said to them, 'You are the sons of the living God.' And the sons of Judah and the sons of Israel will be gathered together, and they will appoint for themselves one leader, and they will go up from the land. For great will be the day of Jezreel." And verse 1 of chapter 2 concludes that section. "Say to your brothers, Ammi, and to your sisters, Ruhamah." That's where we'll end today. How many of you have actually ever studied Hosea before? Got 2 people, 3 people, 3.5?
Well, I read through the Bible every day.
Okay, so but what about a deeper study? During reading the Bible, we'll read through it, but often by the time you get to this section, it's about August or so. Kind of trying to get through it, make sure your day goes on. That's just me. I don't know about you.
I don't really get anything.
Yeah.
It makes me crazy.
I know I've never taught from Hosea, so this is going to be fun for me. It's also a minor prophet, which is always a interesting exercise, depending on how you think of the kingdom of Israel. So I'm looking forward to this. As we begin this morning, we want to just take some idea to acknowledge a couple different things. One is, let's get an idea of where the land is today. Everybody see that okay? All right, so at the very top, you had Assyria. This is going to be the big boogeyman of the threat during the whole entire chapter. Assyria, where Israel, the nation of Israel, will be taken captive in 722, is that threat that's looming, not only to Israel itself, but even to the nation of Judah. They're a threat, they're knocking on the door. And while there are some miraculous things that are going to happen, and Hezekiah is a part of that, they are nonetheless threatened by Assyria. I will tell you at some point in time, it should be on your bucket list to go to the Oriental Institute, the University of Chicago, because there's a place called there's a little piece of, not art, it's a piece of history called Sennacherib's Prison, which is one of the 3 prisons in the world where Sennacherib actually recorded his defeat, I should say his defeat. He recorded his escapades in the nation of Israel.
Wow.
Now, unless you read cuneiform, it's not going to mean a whole lot to you. But at the same time, it's just breathtaking to see that sitting there. And then when you go in, you see this great big winged bull, right? And that's the winged bull that's it was taken from Khorsabad. Khorsabad is where the Jewish refugees were taken when they went from Israel and taken captive. They were taken to Khorsabad, where this winged bull was. So they either would have been there seeing that same bull, or or may have had a hand in building that bull as slaves and captives. So right in our backyard, you've got some pictures of Assyria you can grab a hold of and get an idea. Now, just a few things to notice about there is that we often talk about the Valley of Jezreel. It's a spectacular place. I'm going to show you a few pictures of it in a little bit. But just to give an idea, again, you see that little, come on. There's this little, I can't get there. Right above the word Beth-Shan, there's this little hook of a land. That's about where you start to orient yourself to where the Valley of Jezreel is going to be. That little hook, just a ways inward, is where Mount Carmel is. Right? So Mount Carmel, we'll see a picture of the Valley of Jezreel from that point of view, but there was a monastery that's there. The building is still active there. You can actually go up there and see an entire view, wonderful jaw-dropping view of, this is where one of my videos was taken. You can see a picture of that whole land of Valley of Jezreel. Valley of Jezreel, of course, plays a hand in future prophecy. We're not going to go through that today, but it gives you an idea of where this stays and where it occupies time. So it's in that area. It's a very fertile area. That's one of the things that, when you see Israel, you hear about Israel, the first thing I think usually when I think of Israel is oftentimes a picture I've shown of the desert. It's a very dry and arid land, but not so in the Valley of Jezreel. I forget the statistics and I don't want to embarrass myself, but something on the order of a quarter of the world's birds go through this area and as they migrate from Europe to Asia or Africa and back and through Asia. It's just one of those fertile areas, not because the birds, well, probably because a little bit of the birds, but if you're familiar with how ducks work, as they fly over, ducks and geese, these are birds of the same kind, birds of the same feather, if you will. So the Valley of Jezreel is situated in that area. And again, it's the place in the future where the battle to try and take Jerusalem will be restored or will begin. So one thing I'm going to do is show you a little bit of a picture of the Jezreel Valley taken from Mount Carmel pointing southeast. And then I'll have another video of the Valley of Jezreel taken from the city of Megiddo pointing northeast. So let me just go through these real quick. And if I need to replay them. That is not dry desert, is it?
Not at all.
It's a very fertile area. Now, what I didn't, let's see if I can, one of the things that you should note is this little, it looks like a little airstrip. It's not little. This is one of the two major bases of the nation of Israel's air defense force. The nation of Israel can be at any spot from either of these two places in 10 minutes with all the forces that essentially F-14s, F-15s can muster. All the airplanes are stored underground, so that's why you see just two airstrips. That's all you see. But when they start to take off, the entire valley rumbles. I mean, physically rumble. You feel your feet shake as they get to take off, and they hit the ground. They don't hit the ground running. They come out of the chute ready to go. It's more exciting than watching a bull ring. So that's what it is looking from. I'm in Mount Carmel. I'm at the place of Mount Carmel looking southeast. You can see it's a beautiful, fertile area. So just to go a little bit further, over off to the right, I wish my mouse worked, but off to this right then is a place called Megiddo. It's oftentimes called, if not the Valley of Jezreel, it's called the Valley of Megiddo, where the place of Armageddon will take place. So it's all talking about that same area. All right, so let's take a look at that video and the sound. Let's listen to the wind. No, it's just.
Have you ever been there when the Jets have taken them?
Yes, twice, and it's just awesome. I don't know how else to explain it. It's just awesome. Because they're almost coming right straight at you, and they're by the time they get to you, they're 3,000-4,000 feet in the air. That's how fast they're going. How fast and how up they're going. So they've got someplace to go. They're not standing around. They're not doing tourist. I heard someone pronounce tourist and tourism the other day, the entire day. It's just from Connecticut. All right, so what you missed from here? I'm at the place of Megiddo, where Solomon had stables, a significant place. But what you kind of missed too is this is the area not too far from here where Naboth's vineyard is. This is the area where Ahab's palace is. It's all in this same area. And there are no remnants that anybody's found, but they think that Naboth's vineyard is. I don't think I kept that picture. It would be just over this hill. All right. So anyway, it's a beautiful place. Again, short advertisement for Israel. Go there. Sharon, you've been there. The Hoseas have been there. Gino's there. John needs to be convinced. Said no one ever. All right. So that's where we want to kind of end up, is that I want to give you an idea of the land that we're in. It's again, most of Hosea is a prophecy about the northern nation of Israel. Of course, by this time, Jeroboam has divided the nation. We've got, and this was the reference to Jeroboam and the house of Jehu. It's kind of embedded in this whole program. So let's look a little bit further, if I can move along. Can you see that at all? No. All right. So you can see there are ranges and lines and stuff. All right. So much for that idea. What this is trying to show is that at the very top, Hosea, somewhere in the 7th century or in the 8th century, 700 to 800 is when Hosea, probably towards the very beginning of the century. So again, thinking it's declining, not increasing. So from 800 to 750 is probably when Hosea was around. But that makes him a contemporary of Amos and of Jonah and Micah, if you're trying to keep your prophets straight. And we don't know exactly when his prophecies began, but what we do know is the kings that he was working with. It says that in Hosea 1:1 that the kings, let's read that again. The word of the Lord which came to Hosea, the son of Beeri, during the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. Now there was another prophet who you probably know, who was at the time of Uzziah. Isaiah, depending on. That's a whole nother discussion about, is it AI, is it? But anyway, that place, you get an idea. Isaiah, Jonah, Micah, and Amos is when he was prophet. So those are the kings of Judah. But one of the things that's kind of interesting is that, to me, it's interesting, but when he talks about Israel, it's just a gloss. It says Jeroboam. And it doesn't even say, it says which Jeroboam, but it doesn't say by history, we know him as Jeroboam II. But when he says Jeroboam, the son of Joash, the king of Israel, he's saying this is Jeroboam II, for those of you who are keeping score at home. We're not going to give bingo cards just for naming the right Jeroboam, but this is Jeroboam II. But in some sense, it's a shorthand for the entire nation of Israel, because he's referring to Jeroboam and the house of which he was a part, which is the house of Jehu. This will become important to the rest of the chapter because he talks about how he's going to bring judgment upon the house of Jehu. Well, that's who Jeroboam is. What I also is not inherently apparent in the first chapter is we start to look at, there's Zechariah. Now, what's interesting about Zechariah, Jeroboam died. Zechariah took over. Zechariah was assassinated. See if you sense a theme here a second.
Yeah.
Shallum was the one assassinating Zechariah, who ruled a few months and was assassinated. He died, and Menachem was ruler over that. And then, of course, Pekahiah. Now, Menachem had died of natural causes, in theory, but Pekahiah became ruler after that, who, of course, was assassinated.
They were a motley crew.
And then there was Pekah, who had assassinated. He was one of Pekahiah's chief rulers for him. And of course, Pekah was assassinated.
They were a rough bunch.
And then finally, there's Hosea, Hosea was not assassinated, but he was an idiot, and decided he would stand up to Assyria. I won't make any allusions to current political issues. But I just found that fascinating, that of the kings, they were all killing each other for the privilege of killing each other. That just makes me laugh a little bit. Yeah, John?
The prophets kind of know each other or know about each other? Live at the same time.
Some of them did and some of them didn't. Now, and some of the, you see this even in, is it Elijah? Who gets discouraged and depressed. And then God has to remind him, no, I've got 7,000 who've not bowed the knee to Baal. So I think they knew sometimes about each other, but didn't know each other. Because again, it wasn't common for people to travel around and be near each other.
So they didn't they weren't working the same side of the street, they were all over.
Right. They might have been in the same region, maybe, but even Jonah was completely different. He was prophet. He was running away over to Italy someplace.
I get the idea too, occasionally in the Bible, that there were a lot of other prophets around, we just know their names.
So yes, there was a school of prophets even.
That was you or something.
Yeah. All those unions get their hands in everything, right?
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, good question. Any other questions? I'm still stuck with any questions, and I'm still trying to say, ask me a question, just to shake it up a little bit. Gina, there's something forming on your lips.
I just said that if I didn't know better, I think there were a bunch of Italians. I mean,
It's a silly.
yeah.
No, it's kind of a bizarre, and again, unless you start to look into it, I didn't realize that there was that many assassinations in the last 100 years, but again, the nation goes away with Hosea in 722. They get taken captive by Assyria and taken north. But I didn't realize it was that many, so it was kind of interesting. Now, we don't know exactly, again, when Hosea's prophecies began, other than having this idea that under the king's wit that he served. So let's see. So there are some good things that happened during this time. Let me just blank that out. Right? Uzziah, for instance, formed a massive standing army and spread the influence of Judah well beyond its borders. So Judah had expanded a great deal. Jotham founded a number of towns. So that, again, you had this idea of there's prosperity in the kingdom, that they had enough money, enough spare money to go off and establish new places to live. Certainly Hezekiah was a big influence on his time, even though he stumbled a little bit here and there. But Hezekiah, again, going to Israel, I hope you go through the very cold water up to your inner thigh at certain parts. Go on that trip, and it's fun.
Hezekiah's tunnel.
Hezekiah tunnel.
It was fun watching Gordon and Don
Yes.
walk on the knees.
Oh,
Yes.
Throw in front of her.
Kicking water on it. Ice cold water.
You were swimming.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And parts of it were so narrow.
You were in a diving competition.
Yes.
You turn your legs up. Oh, wow. Slick.
Yes. Yeah. It's just an exciting one. Just the sheer engineering aspect of how they dug the tunnel from both ends to meet in the middle, and how they would use the sound pieces in order to say, dig a little bit left and dig a little bit right, but to meet up that closely within just inches was just astounding. And I think I now shared this before, but it just one of the things early in my career downtown was the tunnel between the state of Illinois building and the Cook County building. They were digging from both ends to the middle, and when they got to the middle, they were 6 inches off, high to low. So they had to back up again, and took another 6 months to dig the tunnel to where you just had this gradual ramp instead of the 6 inch drop off. So engineering certainly hasn't changed a whole lot, but with more or less accomplishments. So again, you see the idea that during this time there's prosperity going on. Even the northern kingdom is probably reaching its largest, under Jeroboam, it's reaching its largest influence. So Assyria is looking down saying, hey, look like there's stuff to be had if we go down south. And so Assyria does start to make plans. But Uzziah, so that's the good part. The bad part, Uzziah usurped the priestly function, and the light from the burning incense revealed the leprosy that marked God's displeasure. This is in 2 Chronicles 26. During his regency, pagan high places continued to attract worshipers under Uzziah. The reign of Jotham witnessed the continuation of the popular idol worship. In the time of Ahaz, the king himself encouraged the worship of Baal. So you find, even in the midst of prosperity then, not a looking to the Lord and saying, the Lord's our blessing, but you find this looking to, well, the Lord's our blessing, but what else is there? And that's the nature of idolatry, isn't it? It begins to draw our hearts away to other things. Judah was threatened by both the Syrians and the Israelites. And then the revival under Hezekiah certainly came at an advantageous time, but it only served to slow down the influence of idolatry in Judah. It didn't do away with it. Remember the nature of Manasseh to Hezekiah?
That's his.
His son or his grandson?
The son that was born in those 14 years that he got it.
Yeah. So Manasseh is the one who would sacrifice children to Moloch. And it would be Manasseh, his sacrifice of children, and the nation doing absolutely nothing about it. They would send the nation of Judah into exile in another 140 years. So, so again, there are some good things that happen, but there are some bad things that happen. And there are some ugly things that happen. At the death of Jeroboam, the northern kingdom entered a period of decline from which it never recovered. Jeroboam's successor, he only reigns, I should go back. Zechariah, he only reigned 6 months. And Zechariah was the last king of the Jehu dynasty. So in some sense, Zechariah is the fulfillment of the prophecy that's here in Hosea 1 about Jehu's dynasty. Shallum held the throne of Israel for only 1 month before he was assassinated. Menachem reigned for about 10 years and was succeeded by Pekahiah, who reigned from just a little over a year and a half. Pekahiah was killed in a military coup by Pekah, one of his officers. Pekah took the throne and reigned about 10 years or so, and then he was assassinated by Hosea. And then Tiglath-Pileser, the king of Assyria, when he died, he was succeeded by Shalmaneser. And Hosea decided, this is an opportune time. Our kingdom, okay, it's not doing great, but I think I should stand up to this new king. I'll show him who's boss. And he said from his new perch in Assyria, that wasn't such a good idea. All right, but again, you see, things went from bad to worse. You had the good, the bad, and the ugly. And that kind of marks out the sentiment of the things that are going on in Israel and Judah at the time. Israel was not immune. All right, so yeah.
Hosea is, he's for the whole nation of Israel, but more for the northern kingdom?
Yeah, for the whole, so again, by this time there's a divided kingdom. Israel is the kingdom in the north and Judah is the kingdom in the south.
Right.
So he's to the nation of Israel in the north.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's mostly his. Yeah, John?
We always see the tension between God and false gods. Was there a secular part of society back then? They didn't care about anything?
There was, and a lot of it was the influence as kings would marry. They would try to form relationships and alliances with other kingdoms. They would marry a non-believing wife. Right. Ahab and Jezebel is an example of that, where Ahab, part of the kingdom of part of the house of Jehu, had Naboth killed at the insistence of his wife. Stand up to him. Take back that vineyard you want.
Yeah.
But this commentary in the Bible always seems to me to be like, well, don't marry somebody else, a foreign woman, because she'll lead you to their gods, or something. And I'm just thinking that, it seems like everybody in the Bible has some sort of god.
Well, and I would put it this way, is that you find the nations having this leakage to begin with by marrying foreign women as part of the kingdom alliances. But after that, the kingdom was on its own and didn't do anything with them. So in the southern kingdom, they went through some periods of, we should clear out the Asherah poles. We should clear out the Baal worship centers. And they did and found some blessing as a result, but they would fall right back into it without even further marrying of wives. They would just now be like a dog to its vomit. They would go back right to it.
So there wasn't a secular.
The secular influence was to begin with, but then they just kept it by themselves. And so that's why in the nation of Israel, remember how many good kings there were in the nation of Israel?
Yeah.
0. Yeah, 19 kings in the north,
That's amazing.
20 kings in the south. Remember how many good kings there were in the south out of 20?
Not a whole lot. I mean, but that's.
8.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were 8. So again, they brought their own problems after a period of time.
Well, like today, though, like, we don't, it's not a battle of like Christians against people who believe in Zeus. It's like Christians and nobody, and people just don't believe in anything.
True.
Yeah, so-
Yeah. And especially your leadership. Leadership is all over the map, right? Yeah. All right, so here's your, remember walk through the Bible?
Yeah, Jay Burnham again. Oh,
Um,
no, that was.
that was-
through the Bible.
That's through the Bible, yeah.
Okay.
It's Jay Burning McGee.
We cut our teeth on Jay Burns.
Yes,
Absolutely, yeah.
still my favorite phrase of his, Paul's theology is appealing, Peel's theology is balling. I can still remember sitting in my car listening to that. And he's referring to a Norman Vincent Peale and the powers of positive thinking. He's talking about that. One of my favorites. So if you remember, walk through the Bible. This is the book of Hosea.
Oh, wow. That was appealing.
And the theme is harlotry.
Okay.
And that's what you should get out of, I mean, again, as you think about Hosea, these images and graphics were meant to reinforce an idea of how to remember what Hosea is about. Hosea is the one that looks like a.
Holes. Oh.
Oh, yeah.
I was like,
Yes. Yes, indeed.
I'm a little slow.
Love you, Mama.
I said, why does she have a nose for a hole? It's like, why, at first I thought it was a snake.
Yeah, well,
And
maybe that's maybe it's a metaphor. That's right.
Okay.
You're there. You're there with me. All right, let me give you my outline. One of the things about walking into a classroom, the guy says, "No books to purchase. Come on, we'll have a good time." Is that like for how long? What do you mean? What's the outline? So we'll probably do this in 6 weeks, maybe 7 or so, because even though it's 14 chapters, it breaks up into a pretty neat package. So the first outline would be Hosea's family as a symbol of God and Israel's relationship. Again, I think we'll finish chapter 1 today, just to take a look at that. But confronting faithful wives from chapter 2, and then the rest of chapter 2, and the restoration of broken families in chapter 3. We get to chapter 4, we start looking now at actually the messages and Hosea's actual prophecies, which break down into 3 parts. And it almost as a series of lawsuits that Hosea is executing on the part of God. God is essentially suing the nation of Israel for divorce. And why is that? Number one, it's not for irreconcilable differences. It's just because they have forsaken God. They bought into idolatry, hook, line, and sinker. And so they have no knowledge of God. There's a lack of steadfast devotion to God, and they've been deceitful. And so God's bringing those 3 lawsuits in order to execute the divorce that he wants to do. So that's going to be the kind of the theme as we walk through it. All right, I'm going to pause there because you're scrambling to write.
We're just gonna take a picture.
Okay,
Can you send me?
I can.
Yeah, that's pretty.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
I can.
Yeah.
I can and I will. All right. So it gives you an idea. So the book revolves really around God's prophecies through Hosea, using Hosea and Gomer's actions to tell a story. Do you remember Jeremiah? Jeremiah had a living parable, if you will, an action idea that, you remember his stinky sash?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. So in some sense, Hosea's marriage to Gomer is analogous to Jeremiah's use of the stinky sash to talk about corruption and sin. The marriage is going to be reflective of how God thinks of the nation of Israel. So the book tells the story in cycles of judgment for sin. But what's interesting is that as you look through these, not only every idea here is that there's judgment to begin with, but we also see restoration. Even in the midst of horrible judgment and persecution that's going to come by the nation of Israel being kicked out and taken captive, there is the promise of God's restoration and God's forgiveness. Even the restoration of the covenant, right? And by covenant, I mean the Mosaic covenant. So the first 3 chapters, which we'll look at this next few weeks, show Israel's guilt by recalling Gomer's harlotry and by the specific naming of the children. And this is a story, though, of faithful God's actions to a faithless people. All right, so let's get into the text. We've got just a few minutes to go. So we'll keep punishing you all day long. Again, I can send this off to everybody. So let's kind of move on here. So let's, what kind of woman are we talking about? One of the first questions comes out. So chapter 1, verse 2. When the Lord first spoke to Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, go take for yourself a wife of harlotry. This is a different version. The NASB 2020 says inclined to infidelity. A wife of whoredom. NIV says a promiscuous woman. CSB, woman of promiscuity, so pretty much the same thing. And the Septuagint says a woman of fornication. Now, fornication in the scriptures is just sex outside of marriage. It's not necessarily with just a young unmarried woman. It's any sexual immorality. So you see right off the bat that no matter how you try to word it,
Not a nice name.
she's not going to be like your bridge partner. What's that?
She's not the PTA chair.
She's not the PTA chairman. No, she's a woman of ill repute.
Yes.
And there's some question, some commentators try to kind of soft pedal it, like, would God really do that? Yes, God had a story to tell, and God really wants to tell that story. So he chose a woman this way, and he chose to tell Isaiah to go marry her. Now, I will tell you that there is some question as to the children, whether the children are Hosea's or not, depending on which commentary you read. I'm not going to dwell on that a whole lot. I don't know that it's really germane to the story.
Good names.
What's that?
They didn't get good names.
Well, no. Well, they will get good names. We'll see that. Yeah. So we get to the word for. So you see the nature of Gomer. Go take for yourself a wife of idolatry and have children of harlotry, for the land commits flagrant harlotry. And that's when he's talking about land, he's talking about the land and the people. Part of the promise for the covenants was for the land. It would be inhabiting the land. Now, when I talk about covenants, everybody know what a covenant is? Anybody not know? I'm not trying to put anybody in the spot, but anybody not know? Okay, everybody's good. So as the people have made promises to God, and God made promises to the people, there are blessings and cursings associated with that. That's part of the Mosaic covenant. Now, to think back a step, I'm not referring to the Abrahamic covenant, because the Abrahamic covenant is a promise of the land, but it's unconditional. There is nothing for Abraham to do other than by acceding to the covenant, by assenting to the covenant, he's to be circumcised. But it wasn't conditional on any part of Abraham. God made the choice to issue the covenant, and it's unconditional. Mosaic, though, there are blessings and cursings. I forgot my picture of Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. I've got a panoramic shot of Mount Ebal,
Wow.
Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, and I'm standing at the spot where the altar would have been in Shechem. So I'll remember that for next week. But you start to see there that, and what's interesting is these spots are not even quite a mile apart. So when they talk about the land, and in Exodus, we're not gonna have time to look at it, but as they stand on Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, they would be shouting at each other across a valley. They were on top of the mountain shouting each other. And so these great choirs, there's the first choir sing-off back in those days. So So he says, for the land. You get the idea that the Hosea will be different than many Old Testament books that we studied. Now, the reason that he's to take a promiscuous woman is because the covenantal relationship between Hosea, that's just in case you remember. I want to see the picture again. The covenantal relationship between Gomer and Hosea. See, when you get fast and you mash them up, all sorts of things come out of your mouth you never intended.
That's like Jennifer.
Yeah, that's right. So he's supposed to take this promiscuous woman because their relationship represents what's going on between the nation and its covenantal relationship with God. So it's very much another type of real life story you can see, touch, and feel. And the land commits flagrant infidelity. So there are 4 commands that are given here. So verse 3. So when he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblam, and she conceived and bore him a son, the Lord said to him, 1. So the first command is go take Gomer. Go take this promiscuous woman as your wife. 2, you're to name the older son Jezreel. You're to name the middle daughter Lo Ruhamah, and you're named to name the youngest son Lo Ami. Okay. So the idea, first of all, he was to marry a prostitute, wife of harlotry, and this was a symbolic metaphor that represents the relationship between the Lord and the nation. It calls the first child Jezreel, which means God sows, which normally would be a good thing. You've seen back to the picture. Again, this is the Jezreel Valley now. It's green, it's lush. The Hula Valley is just not too far away from here. This is a lush part of Israel. This is a jealously guarded part of Israel because there's a ton of agriculture that comes from this area. I mean, a boatload. Well, boatloads plural, and not metaphorically speaking. It's just they ship stuff out. They're an exporter of agriculture. And you see that spot, and over here, just a different view. Over, by the way, in the right-hand corner, you see Mount Tabor, which on the other side of that's Nazareth. So you see everything's like a stone's throw. It's much closer than you think it is. But so in this thing, God sows is almost an allusion to how fertile this area is, and the fact that God is the one who brings it to pass. But what he's going to do is saying, God sows, but I'm going to take the nation and I'm going to sow them abroad. I'm not going to sow them in the nation of Israel. I'm not going to sow them even in this valley of Jezreel. I'm going to sow them abroad. This is the beginning of the prophecy that they're going to be taken captive and they won't come back.
I've got, for mine, for Jezreel, I've got God will scatter.
It's the same thing, yes.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just the difference in the words.
Yeah. So this is, again, it's a deliberate choice to symbolize that God is not gathering his children in, but scattering them out. Right? So that's Jezreel. The second child is called Lo Ruhamah, not having obtained mercy and showing no compassion. I'm going to have you turn to Exodus chapter 34. I think we'll just limit our passage turning to that today. Exodus 34. Now, Exodus 34 is one of those foundational passages that probably ought to be underlined in your Bible, because it's the very first place where God talks about his character in all of Scripture. Exodus 34, and we're going to read verse 6, but I want to back up verse 5. Remember, this is a spot where Moses is saying, "God, show me your glory," and God's not going to show him his glory. Moses wouldn't live through that. But what does God intend to show him?
The backside.
The backside,
The end part.
his goodness, right? And so we read verse 5, the Lord descended in the cloud and stood there with him as he called upon the name of the Lord. Then the Lord passed in front of him and proclaimed, the Lord God, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness and truth, who keeps loving kindness for thousands and who forgives iniquity, transgression, and sin. Yet he will by no means leave the guilty unpunished, visiting the iniquity of fathers on the children and on the grandchildren to the third and fourth generations. Moses made haste to bow low towards the earth and worship. A couple instructive points there. One, I appreciate Moses's reaction. In the midst of good theology, there ought to be good worship. And another way to put it, in the midst of good theology, there ought to be great doxology, a great giving of thanks. And Moses makes haste, it says, to bow down to do that. But it's also the very first point where God talks about himself and his character and even some of his attributes. And we're made in the image where he says he is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness and truth, who keeps loving kindness for thousands and forgives iniquity and transgression. And when you think, those are the attributes that are what are called communicable, things that he passes on to those made in his image. That's who he wants us to be, is that way. He's revealed himself to us. He's revealed his heart to us. And sometimes, again, we've had, especially in the last 50 years or so, people have said, you get the idea that the God of the Old Testament is this angry God, angry grandfatherly God, kind of the get off my lawn kind of God. But here you find himself revealing himself, saying he's compassionate, kind, merciful. And so now coming back to Hosea, keep your finger in Exodus, because we'll come back to that. So, and I mean that literally. Don't lose that spot. We're all losing. So the second child, whose name was Lo Ruhamah, I will no longer have compassion on the house of Israel. In some sense, this is a dramatic change in God revealing who he is, because by his nature, he is compassionate. How can God choose not to be anything other than who he is? It's very difficult because he's choosing not to show who he is to the nation of Israel any longer. His first revelation of himself, I'm kind and compassionate. Here in Hosea said, it ain't going to happen anymore. We're done. Those are harsh words for a nation to hear. And then the third child, Lo-Ami. There's a place, I think, in central Illinois called Lo-Ami. They pronounce it probably different. It's not Lo-Ami, it's Lo-Ami. But the phrase is not my people. Because you are not my people, I am not your God, is what God is saying through Lo-Ami. Going back to Exodus again, verse 9, which I stopped right before that. Exodus 34, verse 9, he said, if now I have found favor in your sight, O Lord, this is Moses speaking, I pray, let the Lord go along in our midst, even though the people are so obstinate, and pardon our iniquity and our sin, and take us as your own possession. What you miss the story, if you don't read the whole thing, is that God is telling Moses about his compassion. Moses has said, show me your glory. And God says, I'm going to show you my goodness. I'm going to show you I'm compassionate, I'm kind, I'm merciful towards those whom I would show mercy. Moses bows down in worship and then asks for one more prayer request. This nation that's so obstinate, this nation which makes cows, and we haven't even gotten to the nation, we haven't gotten into Canaan yet. They're making cows to fall down and worship.
It just jumped
It
out.
just
Yeah, I threw some gold in the fire and a cow jumped out. But even in the midst of this, Moses is now pleading to God on the basis of who he's just revealed himself to be. If you're kind and compassionate, please be kind and compassionate. And we, of course, know that God does and is. But when we get to Hosea, God has said it's enough. And for the nation, he has this plan. And so he says, he's changing his name really from I am to I am not. Again, if you were familiar with how God has called himself, I am the great I am, he's saying I ain't no more. The nation still continued on plowing through their immorality. The names speak really of the order of progression or digression, rather, of the two nations. And so there's this progression of judgment ending with the termination of the covenant of Mount Sinai. And this is dramatic, and it's a result of the choices that the people have made and continue to make. And while God is always the faithful God, we have to remember that the covenant of Mount Sinai, the Mosaic covenant, is a conditional covenant. There are blessings if you obey. What are there if you don't obey? Curses. And that's what Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim symbolize. Again, I would refer you to Deuteronomy chapter 29, verses 22 to 28. We don't have time to look at it today. But there in verse 28, he says, "And the Lord uprooted them from their land in anger, fury, and in great wrath, and hurled them into another land as it is today," talking about Sodom and Gomorrah. God is angry when his covenants are violated. God is angry when his covenants are trampled upon, when his compassion and his mercy is taken for granted. God does get angry. But even in the midst of the difficulty that we find in the first part of Hosea, and watching this progression or digression of the children's names going from I will scatter out instead of I will gather in. I will no longer have compassion, even though I am compassion, and I am not your God anymore. I am who I am, but I am not your God anymore. You see that slow slide into despair, really. In the midst of that difficulty, even as we've looked at this outline, right? You get to talking about in this first section here, Hosea's and God's broken family. The judgment's in verse down through 1 through 9, but we find in verse 10, 11, and chapter 2, verse 1. We find great promise. Even though the nation's under judgment and the nation is reaping the consequences of their choices, God issues these commands and then visualizes his promises not to leave the nation forever. Verse 10, yet the number of the sons of Israel will be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered. This is almost an allusion back to Abraham's promise and having children as the number of the sand of the sea. And that is an unconditional covenant. God is still going to fulfill his promises. And you see those in Genesis chapter 22 and Genesis 13. God will still be even though he's putting the nation under judgment, even though he's going to exile them, he's not going to exile them forever. The Lord promised to sow a redeemed and reunified Israel and Judah back in the land under the reigning authority of a new Davidic king. And again, we read that in Ezekiel chapter 43. Again, we don't have time to look at it, but Ezekiel 43 verses 2 to 12. Verse 11, and the sons of Judah and the sons of Israel will be gathered together. Now, if you recall words that I said either today or other times, the nation of Israel went into exile and the nation itself was never constituted again. But that doesn't mean that people from the nation of Israel didn't come back, does it? Because let's look at, I'll just read it for you. It's 2 Chronicles chapter 30, verses 11 and 18. 2 Chronicles 30, verses 11 and 18. Nevertheless, some men of Asher, Manasseh, and Zebulun humbled themselves and came to Jerusalem. Now, just to point out that those are, of course, three tribes. Remember the tribes of the southern kingdom? Judah and Benjamin. Those three tribes were not from Judah and Benjamin, are they? So there are people who've come from those tribes back. And what we find is that in the midst of people coming back from the exile to Babylon of Judah, that when that happened, not only did Benjaminites and Judahites come back, other tribes from the nation of Israel came back at the same time. The nation never constituted itself as Israel again, but the tribes did come back. So that's 2 Chronicles 30, verse 11, and then verse 18. For a multitude of the people, many from Ephraim and Manasseh, Issachar and Zebulun, had not purified themselves, yet they ate the Passover contrary to what was written. For Hezekiah prayed for them, saying, may the good Lord pardon.
Sorry, what was reference on that?
2 Chronicles 30, verses 11 and 18. And then one more passage again, just a reference. Ezra chapter 8, verse 35. The exiles who had come from captivity offered burnt offerings to the God of Israel, 12 bulls for all Israel. Not 6 or not 2 for Benjamin and Judah. All 12 tribes offered bulls of sacrifice when they came back from the exile. I just find that fascinating, that the tribes didn't stay away. The tribes just never came back. And so you had, in some sense, you had the nation reconstituted as one nation of 12 tribes again. Even though they didn't have the same land footprint, they left as two nations, 10 tribes and 2 tribes. And when they came back, they were one nation and 12 tribes. I don't think I've ever seen that before.
There's a myth in the,
Yes?
in the African American, I don't know, it's African American or about the, have you heard of the Black Hebrews?
Yes.
And they claim that they came, they're one of the lost tribes of Israel. And everybody have this, I say, they weren't lost. They got decimated. And I said, they can't be African because all tribes of Israel came from Jacob. And that usually.
Yeah,
is what I'm talking about.
And I think in to their point though, from whatever spreading out from the nation of Israel, when they got reconstituted again, some of them went down to Ethiopia and so on. So,
Yeah, but it's not.
yeah. All right. So let me, as we wind up to this, so we see one of each of the tribes. And then finally, in verse 1 of chapter 2, say to your brothers, Ami. Remember what the youngest boy's name was? Lo Ami. I am not your God. What do you suppose Ami means? Just by process of elimination.
I am your God.
I am your God. So even in chapter 2, verse 1, you find the promise that God is going to reconstitute that covenant with his people. The nation will not remain in judgment forever. And the nature of exiles is that they were supposed to learn a lesson. And true enough, if you think about the nation of Israel never did idolatry in the same way after they came back from Babylon. There was no aspect of Molech or Baal or anything else. Now, they had other problems. We call them Pharisees that would rise up out of that return. That's another day for another history lesson. But you never found them doing idolatry like that again. So Galatians chapter 3, we'll end with this. Galatians chapter 3, verses 8 and 9. The scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, all the nations will be blessed in you. So then, those who are of faith are blessed with Abraham, the believer. Well, what a tremendous promise to us is that this promise to Abraham, we find in this glimpse of it, even in Hosea, of God still holding himself accountable to fulfill the covenant he made with Abraham, to make a great nation in a great land, as many as the seashore. And what we find is that because it's in Isaiah would make this prophecy as well, it's too small a thing for the sacrifice of this servant to be just for the Jews. The Gentiles were part of that plan as well. You and I are inheritors of the promise of the restoration that comes through the prophecies of Hosea because of what came through Christ. We inherit the blessing of Ami, I'm your God. And not lo Ruhama, but Ruhama. Remember what Ruhama is? I no longer have compassion would mean I have compassion. I am the God of Exodus 34. I'm the God who's revealed myself. I'm full of compassion and mercy. I am the God who fulfills the covenant. I am. And he's our God. So even in the midst of judgment, we find these promises that bring hope. And in those promises, we find our Savior, who died for the nation of Israel, but also for us, as we see all the promises of the judgment coming together. In our relationships here on earth, we know that there are consequences to sin and evil actions. And just as God showers Israel with love and promises to restore them, God calls us to do the same thing in our broken relationships. He showers them with lavish love, and he showers us with lavish love. What do you think he expects of us? But to shower them with lavish love, forgiving as far as the east is from the west. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for, again, your word in the book of Hosea. For in it, we see not just promises that are to abstract people from 2,700 years ago, but we see in them our Savior, who's died for us, who's made a way straight for us to be your people, to be sown from the blood of your righteousness, to be brought in and to know that you are our God. These are great and precious promises. And like Moses, we fall down and we worship. For you are the great God, full of compassion towards us. We give you thanks for the day, for our time together in Jesus. Amen.
Thank you, Mark.